Why China is currently capitalist under Xi Jinping, toward anti-nationalism and anti-imperialism. The 21st century China is capitalist. This represents a dramatic transformation for a country that had basically eliminated private ownership of the means of production by the end of the 1950s, while engaging in some of the 20th century's most radical political experiments during the following decade. Despite the pronounced reorganization of the relations of production over the past 40 years, the Communist Party, or CCP, retained its monopoly on power and is still avowedly socialist, albeit now with Chinese characteristics. China's communist road to capitalism has led to serious confusion for the left, both within China and globally. About how to characterize the current state of affairs, clarifying this issue is critically important for anti-capitalist practice, and it is made all the more so by China's increased global power. Ultimately, this is the question of whether we believe the Chinese state and its opposition to the US-led order embodies a liberatory politics. If, on the other hand, we understand China not as trying to transcend capitalism, but as a lock in competition with the US for control over the system. This led to a very different political conclusion. We must chart our own course of radical liberation, independent and opposed to all existing state power. Capitalism is a notoriously complex concept, and I can only address certain core issues here. Fundamentally, it is a system in which human need is subsidy to value production. This relationship is institutionalized via the universalization of market dependence of the commodity form comes to mediate human relation. This logic of capital manifests not only in the economic exploitation of labor and its attendant class social relations, but also in modes of political domination within the workplace, the state, and beyond. Despite important differences from the liberal Anglo-American model, we will see that China has become capitalist on all accounts. Indicators of Chinese capitalism abound. The country's metropolis are adorned with Ferraris and Gucci stores. Foreign and domestic corporate logos are emblazoned across the skyline, and high-rise luxury housing has brought a very major urban core. China's rapid evolution from one of the most economically equal countries in the world to one of the most unequal is suggestive of a major structural shift. We might also see China's membership in the World Trade Organization. The government's continued insistence that it is in fact a market economy, or Xi Jinping defending a globalization in taboos and advocating for the market to play a decisive role in resource allocation, a sign that the state is embracing capitalism. Similarly, one can find widespread cultural expression that suggests an underlying capitalist orientation, including the valorization of hard work, a crass consumerism, and ownership of the unique genius of corporate heroes from Steve Jobs to Jack Ma. It would however be mistaken to confound such effects of capitalism with capitalism itself. In order to more fully come to terms with how capital has come to be the orient principle of China's state and economy, we need to probe more deeply economy, labor, and social reproduction. In proposing a radical critique of capital, we could, as Marx might suggest, start from the commodity. A commodity is a thing that is useful to someone and contains an exchange value under a capitalist system of production. The exchange value dominates, which is to say that it is a profit rather than usefulness that determines the production of things. Marx begins Capital with an analysis of the commodity form because he believed it will allow us to unlock the entirety of the capitalist system, even though Pierre-Joseph Proudhon already did this 25 years before, and Marx, despite criticizing his approach and his characterization of capitalism in his works on What is Property and System of Economic Contradiction, which is the original Capital, yet he adopted the same line of reasoning of Proudhon with his Capital. The only difference, it didn't add the anti-hierarchical elements within it. If we look at contemporary China, there is no question but that commodity production has been universalized. That is apparent in the vast transnational supply chains that are centered in China. where the exploitation of Chinese workers in factories producing everything from cell phones and cars to medical equipment, garments, and furniture has enriched corporations both domestic and foreign, while resulting in an export boom of unprecedented proportion. Chinese tech giants such as Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, and ByteDance are distinct from Silicon Valley firms in some important ways, but they are united in their effort to produce technology that orient first and foremost towards the commodification of information. Similarly, recurrent real estate bubbles and massively profitable development companies suggest that housing is being produced in response to market opportunities. Across a wide variety of sectors, it is clear that production is oriented first and foremost toward generating profit rather than responding to human need. While an analysis of commodity production is illuminating, it is more politically potent to approach the issue from the other direction. Rather than ask what capital demands in order to ensure its own continual expansion, we should ask how human beings survive. How then does the Chinese proletarian, a group of people whose only productive property is their own labor power, ensure its own social reproduction? The answer is, as with every other capitalist society, that proletarians must figure out some way to attach themselves to capital if they are to live. Basic needs such as food, housing, education, healthcare, transportation, and time for leisure and socializing are not guaranteed as a matter of course. Rather, the vast majority of people in China can only secure such items if they are first able to make themselves useful for capital. It is perhaps obvious that the only reason hundreds of millions of people will make this choice is because they cannot survive in the impoverished rural areas from which they hail. Chinese society is of course highly heterogeneous, straitened with socio-economic division and correlated diversity in subsistence strategies. The most demographically and politically relevant category for elucidating the argument at hand is that of the migrant worker, consisting of nearly 300 million people living outside their place of official household registration, or HQ. This is a gargantuan labor force and the backbone of China's industrial transformation. Once a migrant worker leaves their place of UQ registration, they're forsaken any right to state subsidy reproduction, effectively rendering them as second-class citizens within their own country. It is perhaps obvious that the only reason hundreds of millions of people will make this choice is because they cannot survive in the impoverished rural areas from which they hail, and they are compelled by the market forces to seek force in the urban centers. Capitalist labor relations were politically contentious when they first appeared in China in the late 1970s, as many in the CCP still supported the Maoist iron rice bowl system of lifetime employment. But by the 1990s, the debate had been laid to rest, said no more clearly by 1994 labor law, which established a legal framework for wage labor. Rather than ushering in a highly regulated labor market in the social democratic mold, as was the wish of many reformers, labor has been commodified but remains highly informalized. Even after the implementation of 2008's labor contract law, which was especially focused on increasing the prevalence of legal labor contracts, the numerous of migrant workers which contracts fell over the course of the early 2010s, with only 35.1% having coverage as of 2016. Workers without contract do not enjoy legal protections, making it extremely difficult to address labor rights violations. Furthermore, social insurance, including health insurance, pensions, workplace injury insurance, unemployment, and birth insurance, is employee based. Being regulated to labor formality produce other forms of exclusion and market dependence for people living outside their area of UQ registration. If, for instance, a non-local wants to enroll their child in an urban public school, the first requirement is to produce a local labor contract. This stipulation law eliminates a large majority of migrants from public schooling. Although the mechanism for distributing nominally public schools, such as education, vary widely by city, the general logic is to the advantage those that the state has determined are useful in upgrading the local economy. Many large cities have point-based plans in which applicants must accumulate points based on a series of labor market-oriented metrics, i.e., highest level of education, skill certifications, model worker awards, etc., in order to access public services. Everyone else is left to the whims of the market. The situation for urban proletarians who work in the same place as their QQ registration is somewhat different, and certainly better from a material standpoint. They will be able to get access to public schooling, possibly some housing subsidies, and are much more likely to have legally binding labor contracts. Welfare benefits in China are not generous, and social spending as a share of GDP is far below the OECD average, but urban residents have a better chance of accessing them. Deep class and regional inequities, as well as fiscal problems, plague the system. As a result, there is no question that even these relatively privileged groups must make themselves useful to capital in order to secure adequate healthcare, decent housing, or security in retirement. The About Livelihood program is not sufficient, nor is intended to support reproduction at a social acceptable level. Political power. Not only is China's economy capitalist, but the state now rules in the general interest of capital. As with every other capitalist country, the Chinese state has its own relative autonomy, and one may quibble about which state has more autonomy. But it is apparent enough that the state has hitched its wagon to the star of capitalist value, which has effected a profound shift in governance. This capital-centric logic is abundantly apparent in shop floor politics. China has seen an explosion of worker insurgency over the past 3 decades, and the country is the global leader in wildcat strikes. How does the state respond when workers employ the time-honored tradition of withholding their labor from capital? While strikes invariably each have their own unique character, the police interfere almost exclusively on the behalf of the boss and service they provide to private, domestic, foreign, and state-owned enterprise alike. There are innumerable instances in which the police or state-sponsored thugs have used coercion to break a strike, but one particular prominent example was a violent police suppression of the strike of 40,000 workers and Taiwanese-owned Yuan shoe factory. The historical irony of riot cops intervening on behalf of Taiwanese capitalists was not lost on the workers. If the strike etiquette posed the question, which side are you on? The Chinese state has made a choice apparent enough. State violence has also been deployed in the policy of informal workers in urban public spaces. The much hated Chengguan, a para-police force formed in 1997 for the purpose of enforcing non-criminal regulation, has on countless occasions employed shockingly coercive methods to clear street hawkers and other informal workers from the street. Regularized police brutality has generated a deep and widespread animosity among the country's informal workers, and anti-Shenhuan riots are widespread. In perhaps the most spectacular and violent example, migrant workers in Shenzhen, Guangdong took the street en masse in 2011, when a rumor spread that a pregnant woman had a miscarriage after being assaulted during a Shenhuan operation. After days of widespread rioting, the People's Liberation Army violently put down the insurrection. If we think of capital as not just an economic relationship based on exploitation, but a political relationship which labor is subordinated, there are other important ways in which state action is consistent with the logic of capital. Just as the PRC was embarking on its capitalist transition, Deng Xiaoping in 1982 decided to remove the right to strike from the constitution. Paired with this restriction on the labor rights has been a continual ban on worker self-regulation. The only legal union is that All China Federation of Trade Unions, an organization that is explicitly subordinate to the CCP and implicitly subordinate to capital within the workplace. It is standard practice to enterprise HR managers to be appointed as the enterprise level union chair without even a fig leaf of democratic participation by workers. It goes without saying that workers do not see these unions as meaningful representing their interests. An effort to build autonomous organization have been met with harsh repressions. The political subjugation of the proletariat extended to formal state structure as well. As with all citizens, workers had no capacity to self-organize in civil society, to form political parties, or to exercise any kind of political delegation, so they are entirely dependent on the goodwill of the CCP to represent them, which is not really a democracy. The party no longer claimed to represent the interests of workers and peasants against their class enemies. Since admitting capitalists to the party and advancing the concept of free represents under Jiang Zemin, they are aimed to represent the fundamental interests in the overwhelming majority of the people in China, in combination with the state-effective ban on acknowledging class antagonism. It is clear that social basis of one-party rule has undergone a profound counter-revolution. Even a courtesy assessment of the social constitution of the central government reveals that capital not only has good access to state power, it is fundamentally inseparable from state power. The number of frontline workers represented in the National People's Congress, or the NPC, fell to just 2.89% during 2003-2008 session, a dramatic decline from the 1970s. An astonishing concentration of plutocrats in the NPC and Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress is most indicative of the formalization of capital's political power. As of 2018, the wealthiest 153 members of these two central government bodies had an estimated combined wealth of $650 billion. The legislature has sought to incorporate people who made their billions in the private sector, such as Pony Ma, head of the internet giant Tencent. But the conversation between economic and political power works in the other direction as well. The family of Wen Jiabao, the former premier, leveraged their political connection to build personal wealth estimate at $2.7 billion. In the 21st century PRC, capital beat just political power, just as political power beat just capital. The ruling parties claim that China is socialist is simply not borne out by reality. There are, however, a few features of the economy that are rather different from the model capitalist country in 2020, therefore deserving of somewhat more attention. State involvement in the economy. There is no doubt that Chinese state intervention in the economy is more extensive than is the case in most capitalist countries, but we are concerned with capitalism in general, rather than its relative novel neoliberal form. China appears not at all that exceptional. China's state-owned enterprise contribute 23 to 28% of the GDP, certainly high for today's world. But dirigism is nothing new for capitalism. In fact, three-fourths of Chinese population are employed in the private sector. Appearing not only in its native French, but in a variety of fascist countries, post-independent India, and even KMT-controlled Taiwan, where state-owned enterprise contributed nearly one-quarter of the country's GDP as late as the 1980s. State intervention oriented toward enhancing efficiency, profitability, and predictability is not antithetical to capitalism, but a necessary component. Returning once again to the perspective of workers, we will see the difference between state and private capital is minimal. Tens of millions of state sector workers were laid off in the 1990s and early 2000s as part of the state campaign to smash the iron rice bowl, thrown into labor market for which they were wholly unprepared. This privatization campaign engendered subsidy crisis and massive resistance among the former masters of the nation. Following this wave of retrenchment and theft of worker pensions and other public property, the remaining COEs have been subjected to hard budgets and market forces, including their labor regimes. As sociologist Joy Andreas has extensively documented, the admittedly imperfect experiment with workplace democracy in the Mao era have been eviscerated by marketization, and CSOE workers are now equally subject to management as an equivalent private firm. These firms are in no sense public property. they belong to and are controlled by an uncountable state. The question of land is related but distinct. In the all urban land is owned by the state, while in rural land is owned collectively by local residents. But as a huge volume of research has demonstrated, the separation of use rights from ownership rights has ushered in unmistakably capitalist use of Earth's surfaces. In cities that has meant a historically unprecedented boom in construction and commodity housing that already know that it's fully oriented to market signals. Urban governments are highly fiscally dependent on the profit from land auctions, leading to a tight alignment of their interests with those of developers. Rural hukou owners are entitled to a plot of land through a mass rural to urban migrant world will indicate. It is rarely enough or of sufficient quantity to sustain social reproduction. An upward expansion of the city had resulted in a mass dispossession of peasants. As with the workers in SOEs, peasants had little ability to exercise supervision or control over their normally collected owned land, and the village leaders speak on behalf of their collective. The consequence has been an endless cycle of land dispossession in which peasants generally receive a fraction of the market value of their land, while the catracts and developers cash in. Finally, for those people that do maintain rural air, agriculture in China has undergone a profound capitalist transformation, with land use rights being consolidated by agribusinesses while various inputs are also commodified. The land is formerly held collectively has done little to impede this process. The logic of capitalist value production has insinuated itself into the economy and state, dramatically reformulated China's social structure. But comprehending the class relations of contemporary China is only a first step. A further assessment of the complex constitution of class and other forms of social hierarchy based on race, gender, geography, and citizenship is necessary to formulate a political response adequate to the current moment of profound crisis. A whole series of pressing practical issues cannot be resolved based solely on class analysis, to say nothing of dominant liberal or ethno-nationalist framework. How should we interpret Chinese state effort to politically throttle social resistance in Hong Kong, its promises to annex Taiwan, and Han's settler colonial project in Shandong and Tibet? Is the huge growth in global investment under the Belt and Road Initiative an indication of emergent capitalist empire? What is properly radical anti-nationalist and anti-imperial response to the intensified US-China conflict? There are some of the most urgent questions the left faces today, and there are no simple answers. But this is much is certain. The Chinese state false promise to unilaterally guide the world into a socialist future must be fully rejected by anti-capitalists. Marx's words from the German ideology still ring true today, and I quote, "Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolished the present state of things." End quote. As conforming as will be to trust that an emergent superpower will build the world we want, that is an illusion, and we will build it for ourselves. And let's hope if they stay true to their commitment to truly become socialist by 2050, or at the worst case scenario, it becomes a libertarian slash anarcho capitalist society.